In this video, we'll begin looking at managing mobile devices in Exchange Server 2013. Here's a couple of points just to get us started. Exchange Server 2013 ships with mobile device connectivity and management features out of the box. So even though there is a healthy third-party ecosystem around mobile device management, there's also quite a lot that you can do with Exchange Server 2013's native capabilities as well. When we're talking about mobile device connectivity, we're talking about Exchange ActiveSync, which is also known as EAS, or sometimes just plain ActiveSync. So anytime you hear me say ActiveSync or EAS, what we really mean is Exchange ActiveSync, which is the protocol that is used for mobile device connectivity in Exchange Server 2013. And one of the key parts of the mobile device connectivity process, which we're going to cover here in this particular video, is the Allow Block Quarantine process, also known as ABQ. Now, in order for Exchange ActiveSync to work, there are some connectivity requirements. Auto-discover plays a part in mobile device setup. So when a person is first setting up their mobile device to connect to your Exchange server, auto-discover is how the device discovers the correct ActiveSync namespace, or the client access namespace, and it does that based on the email address that the user enters into their mobile device. Now, if that auto-discover record cannot be found in public DNS, or it's not working for some other reason, of course the user can still manually configure things like the server name, username, password, and so on. And of course, that external namespace for ActiveSync also has to be recorded in your public DNS so that it's resolvable by mobile devices that are connected to the internet. Because they're coming in from the internet, you need HTTPS or TCP port 443 open for the device to make its SSL encrypted connection through your firewall to your Exchange server. And we also need a valid SSL certificate. Now, in the case of your test lab environment, if you've used a self-signed certificate, you haven't changed the self-signed certificate on the server, or you've used a private certification authority, as I demonstrated in earlier videos, you'll find that your mobile device, if you have one that you can test against your test lab, probably will not trust the SSL certificate that it finds when it connects to your server. Now, the issue there is that it doesn't trust your root CA. If you're using an iOS device or an Android device, this is not such a big deal because you can force the device to accept the untrusted certificate anyway. If you're using a Windows Phone device, you may find that it will not trust that certificate no matter what. And there are a few ways around that, such as importing your root certificate into your mobile device. But as long as you have an iPhone or an Android device, you shouldn't run into any significant issues. If you have no mobile devices at all, you can still work through these lessons and learn a few things about mobile device connectivity anyway. So with this Allow Block Quarantine process that is so important for determining whether mobile devices are allowed to connect to an Exchange mailbox, there's a series of workflow steps, if you like, that it goes through to make that determination. Now, it's a very small diagram that you see on screen. We're going to zoom into different parts of that over the next few slides, but it basically breaks down into several parts. Whether the user or the device is authenticated, whether the device is policy compliant, whether there are any exemptions set for that device, for that mailbox, whether that's an allow or a block exception. The device characteristics may come into play if there are device access rules in place. And then there is also an organization-wide default that can be used to control Allow Block Quarantine as well. The first phase is that user and device authentication. So when the device makes its connection, Exchange basically says, is the device authenticated? Now, that authentication can come via a username password challenge, or the device can present a client certificate as a way of authenticating with Exchange. So if the answer is yes, the device is authenticated, the next step is determining whether the user is ActiveSync enabled. Now, all mailbox users are enabled for ActiveSync by default. However, you can disable it on a per mailbox basis if you like, and we'll demonstrate how to do that a little bit later. If the answer is yes, we move on to the next phase, which is policy compliance. So is the device compliant with the ActiveSync mailbox policy that is assigned to that mailbox? Every Exchange server organization has one default ActiveSync mailbox policy. We'll take a closer look at that later. And it includes such elements as what is the PIN code, or whether there is a PIN code and what strength the PIN code is on the device, such as requiring complex PIN codes, whether the device it supports encryption, and a whole variety of other things. Now, if the device is not policy compliant, it will not be allowed to connect. If it is, the next thing we look at is whether the device has an exemption to say it is allowed for that particular mailbox user. So if a personal exemption has been granted for that device and that mailbox, then access is allowed, and nothing else in that ABQ process is evaluated. If the answer is no, then the server checks whether that device is blocked by personal exemption for that user. If the answer is yes, the device is blocked, the result is the device will not be allowed to connect, and no other steps in the allow block quarantine process are assessed. Now, if it is not blocked, we continue on to the next phase. And this is where device characteristics can come into play. So Exchange Server 2013 supports what are known as device access rules. Device access rules can be based on the device model, device operating system, or the user agent of the device that's connecting. And in some cases, the user agent is actually one of a third-party mail application that is running on the device, rather than the native mail application that ships with that particular device. So again, we go through a series of questions. Is the device blocked by a device access rule? Well, if it is, then of course it will be blocked and nothing else will be assessed. Is the device quarantined by a device access rule? If the answer is yes, the device is put into a quarantine state, which doesn't mean it is blocked, but it does mean it will not be allowed to fully connect with that mailbox. And we'll have a look at quarantine in a bit more detail shortly as well. If the device is not quarantined, then we look at whether the device should be allowed by a device access rule. If the answer is yes, the device is allowed to connect, and nothing else in the ABQ process is assessed. If we get all the way through those device access rule checks, and neither a block, quarantine, or allow decision has been made, then we move on to the final stage, which is the organization-wide default. Now, the default setting at the organization level is set to allow. If an administrator changes it, they can change it to quarantine or block unknown devices. If the device is quarantined, a message is sent to the user, and it is also downloaded to the device, advising them that the quarantine has taken place. And you also have the option to notify administrators that the device has been quarantined. So in those cases, you may add your help desk in, or a particular administrator who is responsible for mobile device management. If the device is blocked, an email is sent to the user, but it is not downloaded to the device. And if the organization-wide default setting is set to allowed, which is the default, then of course the device will be allowed through. Now, it's important to note here that when Exchange Server 2013 is installed, with that organization-wide default of allow, no device access rules in place, and no allow or block exemptions on any individual mailboxes or devices. As long as auto discovery is working, or the user knows the exact server name to configure in their mail application on their mobile device, as long as the firewall is open on port 443, which it probably will be if you've published such services as Outlook Web App already, and as long as the SSL certificate can be trusted by the device, then the mobile device will be allowed to connect to that mailbox. This means that it's a fairly open system by default. All it requires is a user to have a device, know the email address, username and password of the user, or the server name, and they should be able to get in. So getting users up and running with mobile device access out of the box is quite simple, but there is a lot you can do in terms of administration, management and control that you also need to know about to make full use of Exchange ActiveSync. So let's jump on the server and have a closer look at some of these things.